Well, like the others, I'd like to start by thanking the Farm Foundation, Megan and her colleagues, for inviting me here and for organising this really interesting event. It's nice to see a few familiar faces and a few new faces, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'd also like to join in paying tribute to the late Senator Lugo, who I don't think I ever had the privilege of meeting, but who certainly did some outstanding work in the interests of agriculture and agricultural trade, and Joe O'Mara, whom I did have the privilege of knowing fairly well during his negotiating career, and who was as effective as he was colourful, and he will be sadly missed. So, it's a shame to lose two great people of our world in one weekend. All the more need for us to step up to the plate in our various ways. The way in which I'm going to try and step up to my little plate today is, well, I've got to start with basically a commercial break, which is to wave this thing at you, which is a paper called Balancing Rights and Obligations in the WTO, a Shared Responsibility. And that's really the theme of, obviously, what I'm talking about today. It's a paper that was produced at the beginning of this year by myself and two other equally retired WTO directors, Patrick Lowe and Hamid Mamdouh. Patrick was the director of our Economic Research Division, and Hamid was the director of the Services Division. I was director of the Ag Division, so we kind of covered a fair bit of the waterfront there. We did this, it was a project sponsored by the government of Sweden as an attempt to try to find some middle ground in a very tentative way at this stage to what is one of the major irritants and sources of grief in the system at the moment, in addition to all the other ones that you've heard of, and that is the issue of the respective responsibilities, obligations, and undertakings of developed and developing countries. And this is often sort of summed up by the words S&D, special and differential treatment, which, as I'll explain, is not so much a philosophy as a set of techniques. And I mean, it is certainly correct. I think Alan Wolf hinted at this earlier on, that this is one of the major kind of cleavages in the system at present between those who espouse a kind of binary view of developing countries on one side, developed on the other, and seek some kind of more or less permanent lesser obligations for developing countries, and those on the other side, where I think the US is, who don't like any such sort of permanent carve-outs or differences in status. And what we tried to do in this paper, which I think it'll be, the organisers will circulate the reference to it. You can get it off the webs. Don't be confused if you look it up. It takes you to the website of the Swedish mission in Geneva, and persevere. It may look like a Volvo commercial at first, but it's in there somewhere. Now, our starting point in this, and I'm not going to bore you with all the history, that you can bore yourself by reading the paper, but our starting point was to see where did all this stuff come from, because as I think it may be one of the many lines that people have stolen from that great baseball coach whose name escapes me. If you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere else. And we, in this sense, we look back at the history. The whole idea of special and differential treatment for developing countries, or sometimes used to be called differential and more favourable treatment, comes, like a lot of other not so good things in the system, out of the 1970s. And it was based on what we call in the paper a minimalist bargain. essentially that developed countries in those days, who were largely interested in doing deals with each other on a reciprocal basis, and didn't particularly want to extend those deals to everybody. The way of reconciling that, the sort of tension between reciprocity and the MFN principle, was through the use of preferences. And why we call it a minimalist bargain is because essentially what happened was that developed countries, the 3 or 4 major economies of the time, did deals among themselves. They protected their own sensitive sectors. Agriculture is notoriously such a sector, with pretty high tariffs and other measures, and also considerable subsidization. And instead of opening their markets to the competition from developing country producers, lower cost producers, they instituted a system of preferences, or various systems of preferences, which gave developing countries some market access, but of course on the basis of preferences is they're not bound into the system in the same way as, for example, a tariff schedule is, and they often come with various conditionalities. So it's very much a second best form of market access, in return for which they didn't expect the developing countries to do very much by way of opening their markets or reforming their trade distorting practices. Hence a minimalist bargain. We don't give you very much, but we don't expect very much from you either. So you set up a kind of, a kind of two-class system there immediately. Developing countries get a sort of obligation-light approach, and the developed countries give them a few preferences, but they don't, for example, reduce their enormous rice tariff across the board, or their enormous sugar tariff or whatever. So that bargain has been falling apart really for the last 2 or 3 decades. It began falling apart, of course, when developing countries began to become more economically significant and become serious producers of things that actually people in developed countries are interested in buying. And the pressure on that deal has intensified. Obviously, it was part of the backdrop to the Uruguay round, very much. And I think it's fair to say that the minimalist bargain, as we like to call it, doesn't work anymore. It's fallen apart. Nobody's very happy with it. The bigger economies hate the idea of developing countries as designated, self-designated, having any sort of enduring carve-outs or lesser obligations, and a number of the developing countries resent the fact that they, in their what they would like to think of as their prospective markets, they're still facing a lot of barriers and the effects of subsidization. So nobody likes it anymore. It's not much of a bargain. What do you do instead? And that's really where we're at present. And agriculture is interesting because it epitomizes, I think, most of the features of this situation, both the negative features and, I'm going to suggest, some more hopeful ones. Because the agriculture agreement that we got out of the Uruguay round was a pretty radical piece of architecture for its time. It brought agriculture into the multilateral trading system where it hadn't been in any real sense. And it did begin a process of reducing trade distorting subsidies, creating market opening, and moving some way towards a more level playing field in agriculture, which, benefits, the idea was it benefits American agriculture, it also benefits the agriculture of Uruguay or South Africa eventually. So, but that, in order to get that rather radical departure, as well as a lot of tough negotiating, there had to be some pretty big compromises made, and which is fair enough. It's better. I still think it's much better to have that agreement, imperfect though it is, than not have anything. And the compromises that were made really do have a bit to do with the theme of our paper, which is, balancing rights and obligations and shared responsibility. Because, if you like, it did continue in a modified way this minimalist bargain that I spoke of before. Essentially, the unspoken sort of deal at the heart of it is that we, the developed countries, we will bring our subsidies into WTO discipline with a process of gradual reduction. We set up this structure of differentiating between trade distorting subsidies and those which are deemed to be less or minimally trade distorting, the famous amber box, green box, etc. And we will improve market access through binding all tariffs, or at least tarifying, well no, they're not all bound, but through tarifying all the previous various strange practices that existed before, quantitative restrictions and so forth. So tarification, the subsidies disciplines, the boxes, these were all new, they're pretty radical. They are still, I believe, I'm a bit biased because I've lived with it for so long, but I think it's still a very useful architecture. But it was only ever intended as a first step. And the trouble is we haven't really got very far past that first step. And what it embodies is one of the necessary trade-offs, well, it looked necessary at the time, is that it includes a lot of what I like to call hard S&D, which is that if you look at the agriculture agreement sometime when you can't sleep, it includes quite a lot of legal provisions creating exemptions for developing countries or special categories for developing countries. Article 6.2, which sets up what's often called the development box, which are subsidies, input subsidies, for example, input subsidies, things like irrigation, that can be used by developing countries with no restrictions. That has become subsequently a very significant element of subsidization by developing countries, by the big emerging ones, not Chad or Mali, but India, China, etc., to a degree that was not foreseen 30 years ago. Likewise, the idea which has been going around for quite a long time now, of which isn't agreed to, but of a special safeguard mechanism for developing countries over and above existing provisions, of, as Alan Wolf mentioned, a special deal for market price support used for public stock holding, an idea which is pushed by India. These are all either existing or sought after permanent legal carve-outs for developing countries in agriculture, what I say hard S&D. Now, the problems with hard S&D are several, but one of the main ones is it's the gift that keeps on not giving, because you're stuck with it. It's very hard to, as we've seen, it's very hard to change rules in the WTO. The only way you can change it is in the context of a major negotiation, usually. And you may enact, as we have done, I think, provisions in good faith to solve what appears to be a contained problem. And 20, 30 years down the line, circumstances have changed tremendously, and that provision is now, having a negative effect, or at least not doing the job it was supposed to do. So, what do you do about it? You'll see from this that I'm not a fan of hard S&D, and in our paper we come down pretty strongly against. Our paper isn't just about agriculture, it covers a number of fields. But agriculture is, if you like, on the extreme of hard S&D. And clearly that's the nub of a lot of the current problems. What do you do instead? One thing we suggest in our paper, and this is on the sort of principle of equal opportunity offensiveness to all concerned, we probably give offence to the US by suggesting that we believe that trying to categorise and reorganise the categories of who's a developed country and who's not is a blind alley and more trouble than it's worth, because the chances of getting agreement on it are pretty limited. But we also annoy a lot of the emerging countries by coming out pretty strongly against binary S&D and this just sort of blanket entitlement. Our theme is enabling rather than exempting. And enabling means a lot of stuff that's already in the toolbox in the WTO. One of the conclusions we came to in doing the paper, in fact it hit me after we'd written it, is that we're not actually preaching anything very radical. You don't have to invent anything new. Most of what you can do to make special and differential treatment and helping developing countries to take their full part of obligations in the WTO is already in the toolbox. It's technical assistance, it's capacity building, it's transparency, very important. It's improving the way the WTO works at its most basic level, and it's making sure that in new agreements you don't enact hard S&D provisions, you enact enabling provisions. Trade facilitation is like that, where the implementation of commitments, not the commitments, you don't have one lot of commitments for him and one lot for you, but the speed at which you get there is to do with the assistance you receive to develop your capacity. That's the sort of line we think S&D and the whole approach to development in the WTO should go down, enabling, not exempting, customized approaches, not a broad brush approach, needs by issue, by country. A Latin American ambassador said to me the other day that, he said, my country doesn't need S&D in agriculture. We're not a developing country in agriculture, but we are in services. So it's that sort of analysis. Getting away from this binary distinction and looking at real needs, real solutions in a targeted and customized way. Thank you very much.